Okay, so this week we're going to be talking about labor supply. And basically, what we're doing is we're building a very simple model of labor demand, which slopes down and to the right, and labor supply, which slopes in an interesting way, which we're going to find out today. Okay, so last week we learned a bit about what conditions have to be true for a firm to want to hire an additional worker. This week we're talking about under what conditions a person will provide one more unit of labor. Now, for simplicity, we're going to assume that all workers are paid hourly and can decide how many hours per week they would like to work. So basically, everyone is their own boss and gets to name their own hours. So obviously this isn't true in the real world, but this is a useful starting ground where we can start here and we can depart from it. Okay, so we'll start at this hyper stylized, very simplistic view of the world, and we'll sort of depart from that. We'll add on things that are real about the real world to that simple model. Now, one of the first questions that we're going to be concerned with is whether or not a person is going to work or not. The trade-off, if you remember, is always between what we call working and what we call leisure, right? So, this doesn't mean that, you're either working or you're being lazy. It just means you're either working or you're not working, right? So, in the notes, I go through some examples. Cutting the grass, that would be a form of leisure if you're not being paid to do it, right? Painting the barn, cleaning the house, these are all leisurely activities, despite the fact that they're not really relaxing in the traditional sense of the word leisure. The second question that we have to answer is how long the person will be willing to work. Okay, so we ask the question, are they willing to work, and how long? Now, at some level, this can be thought of as a decision between being, part-time or full-time, the number of jobs that you're going to hold, or the amount of overtime that you'll put in, right? And other decisions that would need to be made would be how many hours to work out of the home versus in the office in the house, right, if it's applicable to you. And also what type of work the person will seek, as well as geographic restrictions. Okay, so in my life, I work primarily out of my own house. It turns out, my job is easy enough to do from any computer in the world that has internet. And so, as much as I love coming into the office in Big Rapids, I'd rather stay in Grand Rapids and work at, my house. So I do a lot of work there. Okay, but other people don't have that luxury. Right, and so we'll talk about some more of that later on. Okay, now an obvious statement would be the following. Since labor demand slopes down and to the right, labor supply must slope up and to the right as well. Okay, and what that says is that at higher wages, people are willing to work more, right? But we need to ask this question now: is this statement true? And so on page 2 of the notes, I give you guys a table, and I want you guys to fill it out, or at least think about it conceptually. So I've copied it here, and I'm going to fill it out for myself. So at $10 per hour, I might work 10 hours that week. Okay, at 25, I'll probably work probably another 25, honestly. At 50, I'll work at least 40. At 100, I might be willing to put in some extra hours of overtime. At 250, let's see, I'd probably work 10 hours a day for that, so that'd be, I would still want Sundays off just because. That's 60. At 500, well, I might take Saturday off, but I'll still work 10 hours, so we're at 50 again. At $1,000 an hour, well, I'm making lots of money, so at $1,000 an hour, I'd probably work something like 35 hours. At $10,000 an hour, well, so if I work 10 hours a week, that's 100 grand a week. So that sounds like a good one. At 100 grand, I might work 5. And at $1 million an hour, 1 hour a week. I think I can get away with $1 million a week. At $1 billion, ideally, I'd only work 1 hour a year, so that would just be 1/52nd of an hour per week, right? So the interesting thing here, if you note, right, and I suspect something similar is going on with your tables if you fill it out, that up until a certain point, which for me is at $250, I'm willing to work more as I get paid more per hour. But after that, I sort of run into like, okay, I've got all this money. Like, what the hell am I doing working when I could be out there spending it, right? And so, once I hit $500 an hour, I'm kind of like, okay, I'm gonna cut back on work. And really, these numbers should all probably be even lower than they are, and so should this number. But whatever, right? But at $1,000 an hour, that's 35 hours a week. That's 35 grand per week. Granted, it's pre-tax, but it's as onerous as taxes are, which you'll find out someday. $35,000 a week is a pretty good salary. 100,000 a week, $500,000 a week, $1 million a week, basically $1 billion a year, right? So this is kind of weird, right? Because it seems like if labor supply slopes up, then all these numbers should be going up constantly, right? So this should be at $1 billion an hour. I should basically never, not be working, right? And yet here I'm saying I'd only work an hour a week. And so what we actually see is sort of the initial puzzle that I used to lure you into this class, is that the labor supply curve actually bends, if we were to plot this, backwards. Oops, got caught on the paper there. Right, so this could be the supply curve. And as you see, as the wage goes up for a period of time, yes, I do increase the number of hours that I work. But then at some point, here, I start saying, well, my wage is so high, I don't have to work as much, and I actually work less, right? And so that's kind of a weird thing, okay? And so we're going to see if we can explain where this comes from by going through, today's lessons. Okay, now, as we talked about in week 3, a person who has decided to seek work is, by definition, counted as being in what we call the labor force. Okay, with the labor force participation rate being the percentage of the population that is in the labor force, either working or looking for work, right? And so this rate is a very important measure for how willing people in general are to work outside the home. Now, granted, it's a crude measure, but it's still an important one, right? The higher the rate is, the more people are willing to work outside the home in general. And the lower this rate, the less willing they are to do so, right? But which also means that the lower the participation rate, the labor force participation rate is, the more willing they are to stay at home, right? So the less willing you are to go to work, the more willing you are to just stay at home. Now, if we think about the last 100 years or so, we've seen a dramatic increase in the labor force participation rate, particularly among women, and particularly among married women, right? And so, in the notes on page 3, I show you guys sort of a historical trend of the labor force participation rate for women by various marital statuses, okay? And so if you look at it, if you look carefully, what you see is that we have all kinds of, we just have a general increase, which is almost certainly due to the advancement of, social programs protecting women from discrimination and other civil rights movements. So, those were a big thing. But another factor was also, World War I and World War II, right? So in 1910, leading up to, World War I, right? We see the labor force participation rate among women increasing, and then decreasing immediately after World War I, and slowly kind of creeping up. But then again in World War II, looking at the 30s and 40s, we see an increase in the labor force participation rate, and then after World War II ends, we see it continue upwards, right? So, there's an interesting thing. Why did the participation rate for women drop after World War I, but not so much after World War II? Right? Now, one answer that economists have given is that we successfully automated most of the things that women did during that time period. So if you think back in history, and I'm not saying this is a good or a bad thing, I'm just saying it's a true thing. For most of human history, women have been sort of the ones that take care of things around the house or around the community, right? They raised the children, they educated, they did what we now call household production, right? That was sort of their role in society, okay? And this is changing, and in part, it's changing because of technology. So if you think about, one of the classic jobs of women from 1800 to 1920 was doing the laundry, right? Well, the washing machine gets invented, and now women don't have to do the laundry. We can put our clothes in the washing machine and push a couple of buttons, turn a knob or two, and 45 minutes later your laundry's clean, right? So I linked to a great Hans Rosling video on Blackboard. So check that out when you get a chance, okay? But whatever the underlying causes are for this change, the data seems clear that there's never been a time such as today where so many women were entering the labor force. And the sort of exciting thing is that a lot of experts even expect that women will take over the labor markets within the next 10 to 20 years, and they'll have higher wages than their male counterparts. So if you've heard the statistic, women get paid something like 77 cents on the dollar for every hour there, for every dollar that a man works. We'll come back to whether or not that's true. But if we think about it, that's interesting. Why are women paid 23% less than men? Okay, and so there's lots of things going on, but we'll talk more about those, I think, next week or soon thereafter. Okay. Now, when it comes to sort of the decision to work, labor is one of the most abundant resources that a country and economy has to use towards productive activities, right? And so leisurely activities that are not done for pay are important, no doubt. We want to have fun. We want to be productive around the household. But labor still remains a crucial input into the production of goods and services. And as a result, every economy in the world depends on labor. And so the decision to work must be about how to spend your time. Okay, and so again, you can either use your time for what we call leisurely activities, or you can work for pay. Okay, now there are also some other decisions about how best to accomplish a given task. Okay, so should I stay at home and clean the house, or should I work and pay someone to clean my house for me, thus cleaning the house in what we could call like a roundabout fashion. Okay, so a quick example that from my life that'll make this more familiar for you guys. So my roommates and I, we just hired a cleaning service to come in. They clean the kitchen and the living room and the bathrooms, I think twice a month, and it costs $90 a month. Okay, so $90 a month. We get 2 people to come in and basically clean our apartment for us. Okay, this is something that obviously my roommate and I could do on our own, no problem, right? We're perfectly capable of cleaning the house. But it turns out that if you do the math and figure out how much money can I earn per hour, or can the both of us earn per hour of working, and then you factor in or consider the amount of time it takes to clean the house, well, it quickly becomes much more efficient for us to hire someone to do it and just work for that hour or 2 or 3. I think they spend 3 hours there. So it quickly becomes much more efficient, much more cost effective, ironically, to let someone else clean our house for us. And so we do, right? So, but in its place, I clean my house or my apartment, right, by teaching economics at Ferris, which is a weird concept, but that's how it's done. Okay. Now, we can also think about the supply of labor as being sort of the inverse as the demand for leisure, right? The less you value leisurely activities, the more willing you are to provide labor services to someone else. Okay, so the less valuable leisure is to you, the more willing you are to give up your time. Okay, and so we can think about the opportunity cost of leisure, right? So what is it that you give up by sort of like consuming an hour of, say, watching television, right? And so what we say in economics is that you give up 1 hour of lost wages, right? And so, every hour that you spend, if you're getting, let's say you get paid, $10 an hour, watching television for an hour doesn't cost you nothing. It costs you $10. So you are effectively giving up $10 by watching an hour of television, okay? Now, other things that we need to think about are what we can call, wealth and income. And we've sort of talked about this, earlier in the semester. So changes in your wealth and income can lead to changes in your willingness to, forego leisure, which basically means to give up leisure and pursue labor or work. Now, unfortunately, it's really difficult to measure, wealth, okay? Because it can come in, many forms. So the book talks about, bank accounts and financial investments and physical property, right? These things can all be measured fairly easily. But another form of wealth that is, no less important is your, how skilled you are. So your skills, right? As these skills can actually be, rented to employers for a price. Okay, and so like these skills, this is where the difference between what we can call high skill and low skill labor comes from, right? High skilled labor are people that have specific training that makes them more productive, and so when high skilled labor goes to work, they rent not just their time but also their skill to their employers, right? And if you think about it, this is ostensibly the reason why you're all in college, right? You want to invest in your skills such that you can become a high-skilled worker, and then later on you can rent those skills to your employer and command a higher wage. Okay, and so so we have skills as well, and those are also a form of our wealth. Okay, and so there's all kinds of other things in there, but these four measures, bank accounts, financial investments, physical property, and skills, just those four things alone makes measuring wealth exceedingly difficult. But what is easy is to measure what we call, returns to wealth. Right, returns to wealth are really easy to measure because these are quite literally just income, or at least proxied very well by income. Okay. Now so while these are closely related, there are some serious challenges to this in the form of what we call income and substitution effects. Okay, so let's flip this over. We have a clean sheet. Okay, so let's think about income versus substitution effects. Okay, so the income effect right, the income effect is sort of a change in the number of hours worked if income changes. Okay, so it's a change in the number of hours worked if income changes, holding everything else constant. Okay, so holding literally everything else constant, the income effect is a change in the number of hours worked if income changes. Okay, and so let's think of a hypothetical example. So let's suppose that you win the Powerball lottery and you win over $300 million or whatever it's up to these days, right? How many of you are going to show up to work tomorrow? Okay, so let's pretend that you don't go out and get drunk or anything like that. You don't do anything wrong. It's not like you're skipping work because you're hungover, right? Or you're sick or anything like that. Let's pretend that. Let's assume that away. Okay. Now you have $300 million in your bank account, tax-free, blah blah blah. Right? How many of you are going to bother showing up to work tomorrow? Right? My guess is very few of you. Right? And the reason why is what? Why will you not show up? Okay. The reason why is because you now have so much money that you no longer need to work. Right? You're just like, screw it. I don't have to work anymore. I can consume all 24 hours of my day with leisure. And you can, right? And so economists call this the income effect, right? Which again just says that if your income rises and everything else stays the same, including your hourly wage, okay, and this is the important part, which includes your hourly wage. Okay, that's the important thing. So your hourly wage doesn't change. So you still get, 12 bucks an hour or whatever you're getting paid at your job right now. It's just now you have 300 million in the bank, okay? What we say is that the number of hours that you will be willing to work will decrease. And so what we can say algebraically is that the income effect is equal to the change in hours divided by the change in y, which we define as income, and that must be less than 0 because what we're saying is your income is going to go up. So this is a positive number, and the change in hours is going to go down. You're going to go, from working 10 hours a week to working 2 hours a week. Okay, and so, or you can think of it as H0 minus H1 over Y0 minus Y1. So we could say, this is like your initial H0 is the initial number of hours you worked, and H1 is the hours you work after you've won the Powerball in this example, and Y0 is your income before you won the Powerball, and Y1 is your income after you win the Powerball, right? So it could be, let's say you went from working 10 hours per week, and then you went to working 2 hours per week, okay? And your income went from 10 grand to 300 million, right? Well, that's going to be some ungodly number, 8 divided by some huge negative number, so negative huge, right, number. Okay, I'm not going to do that math. You can do that math if you so desire, and you'll get it right. Okay, so the income effect is relatively simple and straightforward to understand. Okay, just imagine you win the Powerball. You're going to want to work. Do you want to work more or less? Right? Most people say less. Okay, now there's an interesting thing which we'll come to later that has to do with the income effect. Okay, but the opposite one is what we call the substitution effect. Okay, now this one's tricky. This one's less intuitive by itself. Okay, so here's the question. Imagine that your income remains 100% constant. Everything, you have the same amount of money in the bank as you do now. Okay, but your hourly wage increased. Okay, so now we're going to hold everything constant. So this is a change in the number of hours worked if wage changes, holding everything else constant. And this includes income. Okay, so what we're asking is, what would you do? Would you want to work more hours if your wage increased, if I hold everything including your income constant? Okay, and so what this is saying, right, is a very weird thing. And the answer is, of course, that you would work more hours. Okay, so the substitution effect is equal to the change in the hours you work divided by the change in your wage rate. And we're saying that this has to be greater than 0. Okay, and what that means is, H0 minus H1 divided by wage 0 minus wage 1 must be greater than 0. So let's say, at first you work 10 hours per week, then you work 20 hours per week. You're making $10 an hour. Let's do different numbers. $15 per hour, and now you make $50 per hour. Okay, so in that world you'd have negative 10 divided by negative 35, which is equal to 10 over 35, which is equal to 2 over 7. Okay, so bigger than 0, right? And all we know is it's bigger than 0. So in this case, it's 2/7, right? So the income effect, the substitution effect has to be bigger than 0, because we say that basically at higher wages you want to work more. Okay, now this is sort of weird, right? Again, this is a very weird thing. So let me pull out another sheet of paper here, and let me do this. Okay, because in the real world, what we see are both the income effect and the substitution effect happening at the same time. So whenever you get a raise, right, you're going to work more hours. So let's walk through the logic of why sort of the substitution effect is weird. Okay, intuitively it's weird. Okay, so what I'm saying is, if you get paid more, you're willing to work more, holding your income constant. Okay, so you work more hours, you make more money, but we're ignoring the fact that you make more money, or your income goes up. So let's say you work. Let's do this example, right? So at $10 an hour times 15 hours, you're making $150 per week. Okay, and at $20 an hour times 50 hours per week, you're making $1,000 per week. Okay, so now what I'm trying to say is, let's ignore the fact that you're making another $850, right? So just assume that away. And it gets weird, right? It's a very strange and weird concept. And so let's explain it sort of in a different way. So let's explain it as this. There's a sort of a total change in your hours worked. Okay, so there's a total change. So, you work 10 more hours. Okay, and what we're going to say is that this is equal to the change due to the income effect plus the change due to the substitution effect. Right? And so we can intuitively understand the total change, right? This is no problem. This is a very easy thing. Like I say, you get a $10,000 raise, and all of a sudden you're working more hours. Okay, so we can understand that one, and we can understand this intuitively, right? Like if I just gave you $10,000, right? So let's say I give you, I give you 10 grand, right? Do you want to work more or less? Well, you probably want to work a little bit less, right? Just because you now don't need to earn that $10,000 anymore. You can just have it, right? And so what we can think of is the substitution effect is the residual, or it's the remainder, right? The substitution effect is the difference between these two things, right? So let's say your total change in hours worked as a result of a raise. So let's say you work from, you're moving from making $10 an hour to, $15 an hour, right? So as a result, you work, 10 hours more per week, okay? So we can say, the total effect is 10 hours, is plus 10, okay? But if I were to just give you, the extra money for free, for no work at all, nothing that you have to do, right? Well, you might change your work by -2 hours, right? You might work 2 hours fewer, okay? And what that means is that the change due to the substitution effect must be a positive 12, okay? So really what we're saying is the total change in your hours worked is 10 as a result of this increase in your wage, okay? And as a result of the resulting income induces you to work 2 hours less, or would if the only thing that changed was your income, okay? But because you're getting an increase in your wage, you want to work 12 hours more, which means the net effect is 10. Okay, so, or let's think of this one. So let's say, you now get paid $100 per hour, right? So you get a raise from whatever you're making now to $100 an hour. And as a result, let's say you work 5 hours fewer per week, okay? Well, we could say the change due to the income effect must be, let's say, negative 20, right? So you are now willing to work 20 hours less per week because of the income effect alone, okay? But because now each additional hour of time, or each additional hour of leisure, now costs you $100 instead of $10 or whatever, right? Because each hour of watching television, let's say, now costs you $100, you are less willing to give up time to watch television, right? If all it was is the fact that you make now television costs you $100 per hour, you'd be less willing to do it. And so as a result, you will work, let's say, 15 hours more per week because each hour costs you more, right? And so the net effect of both the income and substitution effect in this case is -5. So as your total change in behavior is that you work 5 hours per week fewer, okay? And so what matters for this total change, like what we observe is the total change, okay? So we observe the total change in the real world, and we know that we can sort of decompose it, right? We can decompose a total change into an income effect and a substitution effect, okay? This was made famous by a guy named Eugen Slutsky and John Hicks, right? Who were two huge figures in economics, okay? So to analyze this and do all kinds of the fun stuff with it involves multivariate calculus, which we're not going to do, but we will do the graphs in the next video. Okay, so we will have graphs that we'll be grappling with here. Okay, but the total effect is, again, the sum of the income effect and the substitution effect. And which one of these is bigger determines the total effect. So if the income effect is relatively small and the substitution effect is relatively large, well, you'll see the person work more hours, right? And conversely, if the income effect is really, really big and the substitution effect is very small, well, you'll see someone work fewer hours. And so we can explain this from earlier, this thing right here, right? In this region here, it must be the case that the substitution effect dominates or is bigger, up until here. And beyond that, the income effect. Right? So now we can basically say that as your wage rises, right, you're willing to give up more of your time because the substitution effect is larger than the income effect. But once you hit a certain amount of income or money, right, or wealth more accurately, the income effect starts to dominate and you start to work less, right? Same thing here. Okay, so all we're talking about is whether or not an increase in your salary is going to result in you working more hours per week or less. If the income effect is bigger than the substitution effect, you'll work less. Okay? Now, one question that we may want to ask, right, which is an interesting policy thing, is what happens with inheritances? Right? And specifically, should we tax them? Right? So there's lots of people on both sides of this debate saying that we should tax inheritances at 0% because they're gifts, or we should tax them at 100% because they're unearned income, right? All kinds of stuff. Okay, and so economists have studied this, right? And if you think about it, it seems like an inheritance is very little different from winning the Powerball, right? If you get an inheritance, that's not that much different, at least in terms of this model, from winning the lottery. Okay, so what would happen? Okay, so we should expect that if you have inheritances, it should reduce the amount of hours that you work. Okay, so let's think about that. Okay, so one study, economists found that small inheritances, somewhere around $7,700, actually led to an increase in labor force participation rates among those recipients from 76% to 81%, right? So interestingly, which is a weird result, right? If you get a small inheritance, you might work more, or you seem more likely to go to work. But if you get a large inheritance of almost $350,000, let's say, it actually reduces the labor force participation rate. Okay, and so how can we explain this? Well, so there's lots of tricks, but so the puzzle is $7,700 results in more participation in labor force. Right? This is dollars, and 350K results in less. Okay, so how can we explain this? Because it seems like both should result in less, right? So this one makes sense, right? If I just gave you 350 grand, right, you'd probably work less hours per week, right? That's no mystery, okay? But what about this one? Why aren't people working less hours here, right? And the answer could be as simple as they were expecting the inheritance to begin with, and once they got it, they realized that it was smaller than they thought it would be, and that they'd actually have to work, right? So a fun story from my life, I'm very fortunate that my grandfather on my mother's side was extremely successful, and he said that we'd have an inheritance and he'd give it to the grandkids, and there's only 4 of us, right, that are are part of this, and so it was supposed to be very large. Well, turns out my grandfather was not exactly the best man at real estate, and he actually managed to lose money on property between the years like 1985 and 2005. Right, and he passed in 2006. So for that 20-year period where everybody else made money at real estate, my grandfather just lost money like crazy. And so as a result, the inheritance that he left for me is now gone. I was expecting a high inheritance, and now I realize I'm going to get a lower one, and so I have to work more. Tough life. Okay, so there's all kinds of interesting things. Okay, so there's interesting policy implications here. Okay, but the last thing we'll talk about in this video is what we call the reservation wage. Right, and this one's fairly intuitive. Okay, and it's basically saying that I am not willing to work at all unless you pay me a certain amount of money and hire me for a certain number of hours. Right, so how many of you, let's say your job, you get paid $10 an hour, right? How many of you would take that job if your boss said, okay, I'll hire you at $10 an hour for 6 minutes a week, right? So you earn $1 right, a week from your boss. Would you take that job? Okay, of course not. Okay, or how many of you would come work for me? Cleaning my house, let's say, because I'm clearly willing to pay people to clean my house. So what if I said, I will give you as many hours in the week as you want, but I'm going to give you 5 cents an hour, right? How many of you would come down? So 5 cents an hour, that is what? Let's see, $1.25 roughly per day. Times 7 days, so you're not even making $10 a week, right? Even if you claimed that you were working at my house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you still wouldn't make $10, right? And so, and so, how many of you would take that job? Okay, and so there must be some minimum amount of money that you want to make, which is a combination of your wage and the number of hours that you work. It's a product of those two things. Okay. And so, there's other interesting things that we go through in the notes. Sometimes employers don't pay you for the time you spend traveling, right? That's not technically on the clock time, but they have to pay you enough while you're at work to compensate you for the time you give up on the road, right? So, to think about this, I give the example, I know a great place to work that's currently hiring college students at $25 an hour, right? The only problem is that it's located in Washington, D.C., right? Any of you willing to take this job without relocating to the district, right? So would you take that job, but under the proviso that you are not allowed to relocate to Washington, D.C., right? Probably not. You don't want to drive, it's 11 hours from here to Washington, D.C. You don't want to drive 11 hours there, work a full-time job, and then drive 11 hours back only to repeat that the next day, right? That'd be ridiculous, okay? But what you might be willing to do is move to Washington, D.C. And if you are willing to, shoot me an email, and I'll tell you more about that job. This is a serious thing. So if you want to work in Washington, D.C., making about $25 an hour, send me an email. We can talk more. Okay. And then technically, I lied. The last thing is called compensating wage differentials. Okay. Now we talked about this a little bit earlier in the semester, but we'll bring it back today. Okay, so there's lots of non-monetary forms of being paid. Okay, so you can be paid in company cell phones, company cars, nice offices, etc., etc. But there's also plenty of what we can call non-labor forms of labor. Okay, which necessitate being compensated for. So, for one example is actually getting cleaned up and dressed in the morning and leaving the comforts of your homes is something that you may have to be paid for, right? You may have to be paid enough to do that, right? Now, most people consider the opposite, where they're willing to give up some amount of salary in exchange for being able to work from home, because then you can just lounge around in your pajamas all day, right? And so given that it's more comfortable to sit in your pajamas than it is to be in a suit and tie or whatever you wear to work, right? You might be willing to trade off some income in order to do that. Okay, well, the opposite's also true, right? If we instead thought of the base as sitting in your pajamas all day, and then your boss said you have to come into work, wearing a suit and tie, well, it's like, okay, I'll do that, but you're going to have to pay me, right? Okay, so there's that. Or there's risk, on the job risk of being injured, right? So let's say that you have 2 job offers, each one pays $100,000 per year, and one of them has a 1% chance of killing you, right? Well, which one are you going to take, right? I hope you pick the one that doesn't have the 1% chance. The one that the other one has a 0% chance. So I hope you pick the 0% chance of risk, right? But what if the risky job paid you $10 million or $1 billion per year, right? Well, suddenly that risk might actually be worth it. Okay. So other examples of things that require a sort of compensating differential would be garbage collectors are typically paid extra for having to deal with the smell, right? And you can also think of these things, or any other undesirable job typically pays more than desirable jobs, holding everything else constant. Okay, so that's important. Holding all other things constant, undesirable jobs tend to pay more than cushy jobs, right? So let's think of it in the opposite direction, right? Whereby people are willing to be paid less for a particularly desirable job, right? This applies again to me, right? So many academics choose to be professors instead of working in the private sector because of the immense freedoms that we gain. Okay, and if you really think about it, your professors have tremendous freedom. Okay, if I'm completely honest, there's per week there's probably 6 hours of stuff that I would consider work, right? And the rest of the week is literally just fun. I love it. It's a great job. It's great. I technically I work something like 50 or even 60 hours a week, but I only count 6 of them as actual work, right? The other 54 hours are fun. I get to read books that I like reading. I get to think about things that I like thinking about. I get to teach students things, and in your case I get to talk to a webcam that's up here somewhere, and so it's fun. It's a great job. I love it, right? And so I am willing to take a massive pay cut to come work here because this is just so much fun, right? I get to wear bow ties to class, which if you've had me in real people class, you've seen my bow ties. It's a great life. I love it, and I couldn't imagine myself doing something else. And so that is another form of a compensating wage differential, but it's working in the opposite direction, right? I'm being paid less, but I get more satisfaction or enjoyment. Okay, this video is long enough. We've gone through the notes, so the 8 pages of notes that I typed up for you guys. In the other video, we're going to go through a really cool thing, or really cool graphical analysis of indifference curves. Okay, so pay attention for those, because those can be tricky. All right, So I'll see you in the next video.